So a topic that comes up a lot is how do you get along with Arabs, living in Israel? And when I first came here 20, 30 years ago, obviously things were much more calm at that point. I mean, I can remember even we used to just go into Bethlehem from Jerusalem every weekend, because it was much easier to go eat there. Much cheaper, sorry.
Cheaper, yeah.
And so, back then, there was no wall. And there was
what year would that be?
Wow, that was 1998, 99.
Okay.
So
I went in 95, was newly married, and brand new in a water engineering company that had, I think, one of the last design connections to the Palestinian Authority. And we had designed sewage infrastructure in Bethlehem, and my boss was nervous to go in because it had just been handed over to the Palestinian Authority.
Right.
So I agreed to go with him just kind of as a bodyguard almost, and we see these black-coated policemen, and we were kind of nervous, but the food that they wined and dined us was pretty good.
Right.
And a couple of years later, you didn't even feel the tension.
So a couple of years later, when I got here, we were just going down there on the main strip to eat. I don't know if we had spent any more time there, if we would have felt any tension, but we didn't. There was barely a checkpoint, I remember, too. I mean, there was just like a little booth there with one or two soldiers in it, and people just driving in both directions without them really stopping you.
This is, just in case anyone doesn't understand, Bethlehem is almost like a suburb of Jerusalem,
right,
but it's across the Green Line in what people would call the West Bank or Judea and Samaria.
Right. But to give you a geographical, context, you literally drive from the southernmost, neighborhood of Jerusalem right into Bethlehem. I mean, they're more or less connected.
A few hundred meters.
Yeah. So it's very, very close. But as the Second Intifada got rolling, and then we had what was called the Intifada of the Knives, which especially caused suspicion because you never know who might attack you.
Mm-hmm.
And so, life became quite tense between Jews and Arabs, even between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs. It was very difficult to differentiate who was your enemy and who wasn't at that point. And I remember this specifically because my wife works in a hospital, and in an Israeli healthcare, a disproportionate number of Israeli healthcare workers are Arabs. They congregate to that field. So she felt tense going to work, even with people that she had worked with for over a decade and knew very well. So it was a tense time. But, we kind of lived there on the Green Line, just south of Jerusalem, just over the line from Bethlehem. And so it's kind of a bizarre phenomenon, especially coming from America, where you kind of live in this big, isolated, powerful nation, and you don't have to ever see your enemies. They're somewhere far away. So where we live now, the Intifada happens, the knife attacks happen, then October 7th even, and what's going on now. But, not just Israeli Arabs, but the Palestinians and under the Palestinian Authority are just right there across the valley from me. I mean, if I walk out of the fence of my little town, I'm in a Palestinian village. And so you can't avoid the fact that your neighbors, you still see see one another every day. You still interact. I mean, most of the people from our town go to the Palestinian garage, a few hundred meters away to get their cars worked on, or that's the cheapest gas station. It doesn't end day-to-day interaction.
For some of our listeners who might not differentiate so much, within Israel proper, not including the West Bank, there are about 2 million full Israeli citizens who are Arabs, which is like 20% of the Israeli citizen population. So I live among those people in the north, in the Galilee, in an area which has quite a bit of Arab towns and villages. So it's kind of a strange mix because, like you say, I get if I got a flat tire, I go to the closest guy is a Muslim Arab guy, and I kind of read his facial expression, and like if he feels open to me in his eyes, then I'm like, okay, I can come back here. Some people don't feel that way. I don't know if that's just because they're less sympathetic human being or or what. But anyway, it's kind of funny to live your life in not knowing, if this guy is just a barely nominal Muslim who kind of appreciates the general welfare that's more or less provided for Arab Israeli citizens, or if someone will suddenly, get this spiritual, religious thing in his mind and become like a terrorist. But anyway, there's like a little difference between Israeli Arabs who are full citizens versus those who live in the, quote, West Bank, Judea, and Samaria, who we would call Palestinians. We're not even talking about Gazans, who we would also call Palestinians, even though they're separated geographically from the rest of from the West Bank.
And, to kind of get into an area of this that, maybe is a little bit harsher, maybe is even controversial to talk about, October 7th kind of ramped up, escalated this whole tension and suspicion, 1,000 times even, let's say. Because, one of the big stories out of October 7th was, how did Hamas know so much about not only the kibbutzim, but who was living in the kibbutzim and where they lived, even house numbers, everything. And we came to find that, Arabs who were working in these kibbutzim had given information. Some of them were Gazans who had been allowed to come in and work on work permits, but some were Arabs who lived in the area as well, Israeli Arab citizens. And so, this ramped up the suspicion that now we really don't know who is the enemy. Is there an enemy within as well? And, from a spiritual angle, it also got me thinking, if, there are like 2 billion Christians in the world, right? But a huge proportion of them we would consider to be nominal Christians. They were born into Christianity. They're not necessarily practicing Christians. But, if tomorrow you turned on the TV set and Jesus was descending onto the Mount of Olives on TV in front of everyone, suddenly all 2 billion of those Christians would become very, very pious in a moment, right?
Yeah.
And so, people started to raise the concern that, so we have a lot of Muslims living amongst us, and most of them are nominal Muslims or, whatever, quote unquote, friendly Muslims, if you to use a simplified term. But what if, as many people, and especially Muslims, thought on the morning of October 7th, the day of judgment had arrived. Allah was delivering the enemies of Islam into the hands of the jihadists. Whoa. Suddenly, a lot of nominal Muslims are going to become very pious.
Wow.
And that creates a feeling that maybe we do need to keep certain people and certain sectors of population at arm's length, even if we don't engage in hostility. We need to be more careful than we were before.
Uh-huh.
And it's a difficult topic to get into, because even saying it now, I feel a bit uneasy because I don't want to look at the Arabs who live next to me or who are in my neighborhood in that way. I mean, I know them, they're fine. We don't have any problems. But when I think about it in that way, disconnecting it from my personal life, I
pray that they don't have a, quote, Muslim revival. Back to the slightly, so that is pretty heavy. And like there's plenty of older Israelis who actually were born in Muslim nations. Some of my wife's relatives were born in Arab nations. And so like those people, when you talk with them, they say something similar, like someone who was kind of brought up in Islam, they're 99% wonderful, fine, but you don't always know what could suddenly click into a certain kind of allegiance that would change things. On a slightly more biblical note, or less alarmist, there is a verse in Leviticus 19:33 that for me has some bearing. It says, "When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God." So even though Arab-speaking people lived here hundreds of years, they're still in some way like a foreigner, even though they are native born. So anyway, I think in general, the Israeli society does a pretty good job treating the minority with reasonable fairness. I don't know if you want to go there a little bit and what your impression is.
Well, I mean, obviously we're kind of touching on the whole idea of quote unquote apartheid, this accusation that is hurled at Israel all the time, which is of course just absolute nonsense. I mean, the apartheid thing is just nonsense, obviously. There would not be an Arab on the Supreme Court, and there would not be Arabs in my children's army units, and there would not be Arabs working with my wife at the hospital if there was actually apartheid here. So there's no apartheid, obviously. But any nation that has different racial segments within it, you're always going to have some tension. It's not only in Israel. This exists anywhere where you have different ethnicities living together in one nation. So when you consider that, and consider that Israel's not a special case in that regard, Israel, I believe, having just briefly looked into other countries where this phenomenon exists, Israel does better than most, if not all, in treating its ethnic minorities and religious minorities with fairness and doing all it can to make sure that everyone has equal rights, civil rights.
I think I would have to agree, even though I do have personal friends who are Arab Israelis who would probably not state it quite as positively.
Sure.
And
anytime you're the minority, you're obviously going to see it differently than someone who's a majority. But
I think for me, also that you and I were both born in the United States, which is probably even though there's racial problems there, it's in general the best, quote, melting pot nation that I know of, maybe in history. I think Canada would probably be also very similar. But other than those two countries, most countries in the world have kind of a native ethnicity, and that's just kind of the way it is. Europe, would be having a very big upheaval now in how they've opened the doors to a lot of immigrants and are kind of...
Well, in Israel, it's actually a very special case in this regard, what you're talking about, because even though all the people returning are of one ethnicity, Jewish, they're coming from such diverse backgrounds that Israel's fractured even within the Jewish ethnicity, because you have those coming from the Middle East, you have those coming from North Africa, you have those coming from India, from North America, from Europe, from South America,
from Iran, from Persia.
From Iran and Persia. Yeah, it's a crazy mix of cultural backgrounds, if not ethnic backgrounds. So Israel is very much a melting pot as well, even though all the people returning are Jewish.
They have a word for that in Hebrew, which is called kibbutz galuyot. It means really the ingathering of the exiles. And we'll close with this as a funny joke. When I was first in Israel, I know what a kibbutz is. A kibbutz is the agriculture village with a lot of common kind of possessions. And so I noticed that every town in Israel had a thing called kibbutz galuyot. And I said, how can there be a kibbutz in the north and in the south with the same name? But it's not a kibbutz. It's the verb of gathering, the ingathering of the exiles. But anyway, back to the subject of Arabs and Arab-Jewish coexistence. I think, like you said, Israel has done a pretty good job. Not perfect. There's room to improve, and certainly kind of a Bible-based love for your neighbor and not kind of an ethnic superiority is something we can grow in.
Sure. And, and I think at the same time, on the other side, events like October 7th are going to further weed and thresh out that population as well, where you're beginning to have a real divide between those Arabs who don't want to stand with Israel, even internally, even citizens, and those who say, you know what, this is our home, this is the place we need to defend. Anywhere else, we can't live like we live here. And so they're siding with Israel
already hear some voices
much more
like
strongly.
That. Yeah.